All right, welcome back. This is Kevin McCain with Horror Classes and Kevin McCain Studios. So we're going to be doing a little watercolor today. We're going to be doing a monochromatic or grisaille painting. Grisaille meaning in grays. Monochromatic just means one tone. In this case, we're going to be using gray, so I could use either one. So for my painting, I've got some cold pressed 140-pound 140-pound watercolor paper arches. I've also got a 1-inch flat that I'm going to be using. I've got a 3/4-inch flat, 1/2-inch flat, and a number 10 brush. Now maybe since I'm doing this for the watercolor class, where I think I said, hey, all we really need is a 1-inch and a 10. Maybe I'll just do it with these two, so that way I'm dealing with the exact same equipment that you guys are using. We're going to be using paper towel. I always have paper towel around when I'm doing watercolor, and so we're going to definitely want some watercolor or some paper towels for our watercolor. And of course, got my palette here. This is a solid surface palette. You can use anything with porcelain. Anything that's porcelain covered is a great palette to use. Porcelain loves water. And so it makes working within watercolor, like a dream. Again, I have my paper 140-pound arches, and it's cold pressed. I've got my water over here because I'm a lefty, so everything's set onto the left, and I've got more paper towel over here. I've done a quick drawing here. We're going to be painting the sphere and the cube, and so I've done a drawing here of the cube and the sphere. And fairly lightly. I don't know if you can even see it. If so, it'll probably be kind of a ghostly image. And it's actually a little darker than I normally would do it. I draw the thing in and then I try to erase it out almost completely, so there's barely just a hint of it. This is much darker than I would normally leave it. And we're just going to be using some of the simple techniques that we learned before. Mostly today we're going to be using gradated washes, flat washes. We might do a little bit of dropping some color in. Sometimes when you get color, you can't get to build up anymore. You can drop in color to build it up a little richer, a little bit darker. And so we're going to be using some of these basic techniques. I might be using a little bit of removing or subtractive method right here. But that's maybe a little dropping in, flat washes and gradated washes, and that's pretty much it. So we're going to keep it pretty simple on the technique. And so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put in a ground. Now, for those that are taking the class, I sent you a photograph of the sphere and the cube. And there's lots of cloth and stuff in. I've dropped this out. I have just one line that's behind the cube to say, hey, this is the table and this back here is the wall. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and mix up a value, and we're just going to do a flat wash for the back wall. We're not trying to, and we're trying to make sure it doesn't get too dark, right? So I'm going to go ahead and keep this a very watery wash, as people would say. The reason that this is such a nice palette is because see how the water doesn't bead? I can really see exactly what value I've got there. So I'm going to go ahead, but I don't have enough of it. I don't have enough for the background. So I need a lot more water. Again, many times people are very surprised how much it takes to actually fill in a space like that. Now, the wall is actually an off-white, and the tablecloth is actually white. I think I'll go ahead and put a little photograph in here of what I was working from. But again, we're going to go ahead and I think I'll just test this out right there. Yeah, that should be good enough. So I'm going to go ahead and start off over here. Now I don't care. I've got I've ruled a line through here, and I don't care if I break outside that line a little bit. So now this, of course, this stuff over here I care about. Whether I break out that line and that's where the mat is, I don't care. So I'm going to go ahead and go right by there. Now whenever we're working, we've got 10 minutes to get this thing filled in. And that's about it. So I got maybe 15 tops, but you know, you're really pushing it at that point. So I'm going to go ahead and start off by, again, bringing this wash in here. Now, so I need to work quickly. Now I can't to cut in around there because I can't let that dry or it'll create a water line, and that's not wanted. You don't want that. And so I'm going to go ahead and bring my brush in here and cut in around that right there. I can see this is gonna have to move. Okay. All right, and I need to hurry because this is going to start creating a water line over here. I'm going to go ahead and cut around this sphere with my round. I have to make sure that that doesn't just stay either, you know, create that a water line. Once you have a water line, there's no getting it out. Or if you do get it out, you're going to have to really be aggressive with it in a way that you're usually not going to want unless you really beat up your paintings. Most watercolors do not. So we want to be very careful that we don't let water lines, you know, you don't want to sit there too long. But just by putting a stroke next to it, it re-wets the area. And that keeps it so it won't create those water lines. Now, of course, if I leave that one there too long, that'll create a water line too. So I've got to constantly make sure that line doesn't sit there for too long, or I'll wish I hadn't. Okay. So that's all I'm doing. I'm trying to get this wash in here. I'm going to get my 1-inch brush again, and we're going to go ahead and finish this off. Now, once I've done this, I've been putting this on dry paper. So now the paper is actually wet, and so this would be the time where, now that's wet, I can go back in here and if I needed to, and I could play with it a little bit. It's taken me quite a bit of time. I've probably been on this, you know, somewhere around 3 to 4 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, because sometimes it'll really fly when we're doing this. But if this gets too dry, there's another problem called blooming, where that's if you take a wet brush over an area that's become a semi-wet area, and that hasn't quite got here yet, but it was getting close. And so again, if I'm gonna, like right now, I'm trying to drop in some paint to darken this a little bit, and I won't be able to do this, you know, too much longer. It's drying out very quickly. So now I just darken a little bit of this side of the wall. Again, I can go ahead if I wanted to and see if I could. So my edge wasn't quite all the way to the line, so I'm trying to clean that up. I'm using just the corner of this flat brush, which is really good for edges like that. Okay. I'm using very little pressure. You try to float this on. Usually people are way too heavy-handed when they first start dealing with watercolor. And so you want to use a light touch. I'm even using my brush at an angle. I don't want to be painting this like I'm painting like my wall or something. I'm using my brush almost parallel to the surface so I can really just kind of float stuff on the surface almost. I'm trying to have as little pressure contact with the paper as possible. Otherwise, I'm going to have some issues start to happen because the fact that I'm whenever you're, see, that's starting to dry out a bit. If you're ever too aggressive or too rough with the paper, it's going to rough up that surface. There's also called babysitting your edges, and that means you're trying to let your edges make sure that, because once you have water lines in there, it's very hard to get rid of those. So again, I had one where it wasn't quite trimming around that very well, the sphere. Okay, so we can't work in an area that's wet, so that means all these areas are off limits. So I'm sitting here trying to look at my, what we call our game plan. I'm trying to formulate my game plan. And all that just means is that you're trying to say, hey, what am I going to do this step while, what am I going to do around here while this is drawing? Now, there is something I can do, and I didn't put in my, there's a cast shadow here that I didn't have put in here. And again, I'm simplifying this cast shadow. There's like bumps because of the cloth and stuff, but I'm trying to just act like this is a flat, completely flat, well-ironed tablecloth. And this is a white tablecloth, and that's a back wall with no, you know, really simple. So, what I'm going to do is, now this is supposed to be a white tablecloth, but it's going to have, at least towards the back, you know, this is supposed to be getting lighter, going darker because of light traveling across a flat surface. That means back here there might be a little bit of value. Well, not that there might, but that there would. And so I'm going to go ahead and put just a little bit. Now, I'm not going to touch that previous wash because otherwise they'll just flow together. And I don't want that. So I'm leaving it sort of a light, I'm leaving a white a line between the two washes. So that way it won't just bleed into one another. Now I put down a couple strokes with just a light wash, and then I don't want it, I want it just to be white. So I'm going to go ahead and get just plain water and soften that up. Plain water and soften that up. Now whenever we're watercoloring, we need to be aware of something. And that is, when watercolor is wet, it looks darker than what it will be when it's dry. And that's one of the things to get used to watercolor. There's an old adage, if it's the value or the color you want when it's wet, it won't be the color you want when it's dry. So there's times we have to go a little bit darker. Now mostly that happens in the dark values. So in the lighter values, it doesn't dry down as dark, pardon me, it doesn't lighten as much, is what I meant to say. So, but understand that this will change as it dries, and we need to be aware of that. Because otherwise, we always have these light paintings. Now, some people in watercolor will say, well, that's just the way it is. It's watercolor. Watercolor is always on the light side. And that's fine if you want to do watercolors like that. But there are plenty of artists that don't do watercolor like that. So I'm always one that's, you know, I like people to give me rules that actually apply rather than rules that are kind of like, this is my personal prerogative. That's one of those that's kind of like a personal prerogative, because I know I've seen, you know, not Ansel Adams, pardon me, he's a photographer, but Andrew Wyeth, you know, who was a famous, you know, very, very famous painter, worked in watercolor, N.C. Wyeth, and of course Jamie Wyeth. They're a multi-generational artist family. And he did paintings that were just as rich and had a full range of value, anywhere from the lightest lights to the darkest darks. So this whole idea that, well, if it's watercolor, it's just going to naturally always be on the lighter side, is not true. And again, and he's just one example, but there's many watercolors out there that that have a full range of value. It's not just, you know, light, washy little paintings. Some are actually fairly dark and foreboding and stuff like that, and that's neither a bad thing nor a good thing. It's just a thing. It's just what you want to do. If you're trying to make, you know, paintings that are darker with watercolor, you can. If you want to make them lighter, you can. It's all about getting control of your medium. What I don't appreciate is people that say that there's, well, it's only this way, when in fact it's not. It may be the way that they like to work. It may be the way that it's a personal prerogative. It's not an actual rule that applies. It's just a rule that they like to apply. And so that's opinion. And so I try to stay away from rules that really aren't rules. They're just a person's personal preference. Like, which is better, broccoli or cauliflower. Well, it depends probably on who you're talking to and how it's prepared. But to say that, one thing has to be done this way and only this way and there is no other way, that's probably a little ridiculous. Probably a little bit of nonsense. And that's what I try to stay away from. I try to stay away from stuff that just is not really the case. Okay. So I just sort of try to indicate a little bit of the cast shadow in there and have a little bit of a gradation. I might be able to get a little bit darker. Now I've got a lot less water in this. So that's called a milky mixture because there's so much less water. And because of that, I'm using it in a semi-wet brush. Remember, all the wash stuff that I've been using up to this point has been wet and on dry, and then manipulating it back into that wet wash we created. Whereas now I'm using semi-wet paint, and it moves a little differently. And that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing if that's the case. We want this. And that I can do a little bit better with a little better edge work, as people would call it. Now what you don't want to do is get too much water in this, because this is starting to settle into the paper. And if I put like a wet brush on here, it's going to push the paint aside, and it's going to be lighter paper there, and it's going to look like a little blossom. It's called a bloom. And that's what causes those. And when I was first doing watercolor, they never talked about some of the technical aspects. They're just like, here's some brushes, here's some paint, here's some water, have a good day. And they, start saying, well, I want you to paint like this, or I want you to do a monochrome painting, or what have you. And that's fine. That was fine for what have you. But it certainly didn't teach us very much about the basic technique, or the way that watercolor works, or the way that it moves. And I wish they had, because it would have saved me a whole lot of angst and, stress and all kinds of things when I was in college studying, because I never had someone just say, hey, you know what, this is the way this stuff works. It would have been just altered my painting technique. It would have given me stronger paintings. So I like to talk a little bit about the technique, because I think, sometimes I have people that have done watercolor before or what have you, but they haven't had a lot of talk about technique. And I'll tell them some things. They'll be like, wow, I wish I'd heard this. And I'm like, yeah, I gotcha. I wish I'd heard it too, So I try to teach people the way I wish I had been taught. And I still had, some good teachers in other ways, but, there were some times where I was like, man, why don't you guys just sit down and give me some technique instruction, for heck's sake? Why not? What would be the downside? So this is all still wet. I just tried to touch this, and it's cool to the touch. So if this is cooler than this, that means it's still wet. And then this is still wet over here. As this is drying, I would have a what we call a thirsty brush, or maybe a dry brush. Maybe not thirsty, but at least dry, and maybe thirsty. Because what you can do is you can pick up just a little bit of the paint as it tries to bleed. You can babysit that edge. You can keep the edge from getting out of control as it bleeds out. So that way it just stays soft, but it doesn't look like, like it's an out of control wash. So as your edges are drying a lot of times you'll find yourself babysitting. You're going to go ahead and make sure, and I've got a dry brush with just a little bit of paint in here. So I'm introducing some paint too. And now again, you got to be really careful with this, because you don't want to bloom. Once you got a bloom there, it's game over, and you got to blot the whole area, or you just got to live with it. That's another one where people say, oh no, that's just part of watercolor. No, it's not. It's a part of people who can't, you know, if you're trying to do blooms, fine, but if you're doing blooms because you don't know how to not do blooms, well then that's not good. You want to have the control you can. Now, again, some people will use techniques. Some people will use blooms on purpose, and when they're done on purpose, they can be an extraordinary tool in your arsenal. If everything you're doing looks like it's blooming, well, that's just, you know, looks like, oh, look, someone needs to, you know, perhaps they can't control their watercolor. And so, and watercolor is, you know, it's fun. We want this to be fun. We want it to be exciting, and who wouldn't? But there are some things that, again, we can do to help our paintings have, you know, have more control, have the paintings do what we want, and not just have us succumb to whatever the painting wants, or whatever the happenstance of what water and watercolor does on paper, because it can get away from you if you're not careful. So we always have to really be aware of the water. So we're going to come back here as this is drying, and then we're actually going to get into here. We're really at a point where either I have to get out a hairdryer and dry this out, or I just have to wait until this is dry. So we're going to come back once this is set up, and we'll get into this area. All right, back in a bit. All right, we are back. So I'm feeling this. It's still a little cool, which makes me more than a little nervous, but I think we're gonna risk it here. And I'm gonna paint the sphere, because if the sphere isn't gonna work, it doesn't matter what is happening anywhere else. So before I paint the sphere, because I want a gradated wash. In other words, I want the transitions of value. And so we're gonna start with mixing up 4 different puddles of value. And I'm going to use my round brush. Now, usually we use the biggest brush we can, but it's just this is just too big to be using on that. So I'm not using that. Just, you know, and then there's some people that probably be like, I could totally do it. Yeah, I don't doubt it. I never claimed to be, you know, the most facile watercolor artist out there, but I can get away with this. Now, I wouldn't do a smaller brush than this. In fact, I wish I had a 12 round. This is a 10. Because again, you want to use the biggest brush you can possibly stand to use at all times. Okay, so now I've got some puddles out here of the water, different values of watercolor is what I meant to say. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start off with the lightest, and we're going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead. And now, I'll start with the light values, as far as that goes. And I'm trying to kind of gauge this. So again, remember that this is going to get lighter as it dries, so I need to keep that in mind. Now, the sphere that I'm painting is made out of cardboard, so it's a brown, and so again, the value, it's darker than the white wall. And so that's why I'm talking about gauging value, because it has to be dark enough to that white wall that it looks like it could be, you know, made out of cardboard. Now I'm wetting this so I can actually make sort of a gradation very quickly. I'm just using straight water, and this will let the paint flow a little bit more. And I want to err on the side of being able to have. Now this is not white, so it won't have a white highlight. But I did something with some color. See how that brush pulled paint off? That was because the brush had gotten a little thirsty. And so if it does that, it'll actually start pulling paint right back off. And there's times we'll use that to our benefit. There's times where we're not gonna play with it. There's other times we're like, oh, we need it. We need it to do that. I got to get this wet over here. It's going to cause, again, one of those water lines. And this right here is a water line. Now, it's not as crisp as I'd like, and it's probably going to show up when I go over it, like so. But let me see if I can lift it up a little bit while I'm playing with it. All right, so now it's all wet. And this is when it's workable, is when everything's wet. If everything is not wet like that, if it starts to dry, then you lose control. And for whatever reason, we are control freaks. We want to have control. And I understand, because, you don't want to have your painting look like you had no control over it. So, of course we want to be in control. But when I say that, what that means is that we'll tighten up. We'll be like, we start to tighten up and thinking somehow that's going to help us. But it actually doesn't. It actually is the opposite of what we need to do. We need to actually loosen up. And so now I've got this. Actually, I'm going to try to see if I can soften that water line just a little bit by picking up a little bit of the paint. Well, let's soften it a little bit. Maybe we can get away with this. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to come in here. So we've got sort of middle values and light values as far as that goes. And we need the shadow side of this. And so I'm getting some darker paint. This will flow as long as this is wet. Okay. And now you can see me tap this a little bit. What I'm doing when I'm doing this is I'm dropping in. There's times when you want to be able to do that. It'll just flow a little differently than if I just stroke it. Okay. So all right. So we need something to look like it's light and shadow. Before I did that, you couldn't tell what was light, what was shadow. So it needed some dark. Now you see me tapping again. I'm trying to move the paint around. So there's times where it looks like I'm doing this. It looks like I'm stippling. That's where you're making little dots, right? And there's times, yeah, you will do that to get have more control over the paint. Okay. So I'm also controlling, trying. Now you see this value is creeping over here. I got to be careful that, not that I don't want some value to be a little bit darker over there, but it'll bleed like halfway across this if we're not careful. So I actually need to load some paint in here and drop some paint in. I may need to re-wet it over here because it's getting a little on the dry side. And again, we only have control when it's wet, not when it's dry. And so again, if we let it dry out, thinking, oh, I'll be able to control it now. That's not the way watercolor works. It has to have water, so it has to be wet. Otherwise, you're just gonna be dry brushing. And for these thin passages where we're trying to do these form shadows, it'll always look like you're, as people love to say, overworked, and that just means that you're never going to get a nice transition or gradation of tone when you're taking out some of the water to control the water. I'm doing it at the back of the ferrule back here, so that way it's not sucking the paint out. It's going to take some of the paint out, but it's taking more of the water out. So I'm trying to control my brush as I'm using it to get a little better gradation. Dip this in some water, but take out some of that water because I don't want it too wet. I want it semi-wet in terms of my brush. And try to get a little bit more paint in here. You need it wet enough so you see that kind of melt when I put it on there. That's what it's got to be wet enough, or it won't melt in like that. Now I'm getting kind of to the point where I need to leave this alone, but my darks have no richness really, so I need to come in here a little bit more because that core shadow is much darker than. And remember, this is going to get lighter. In fact, this will get lighter by about 30%. So, again, I need it darker than by about 30% of what I want to, what it will be when it's dry. So again, I need to make it darker because it's going to get lighter as it dries. Now, I got my dark tones over here. Got a little reflected light up there. There's a little bit of a cast shadow down through here. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull out a little bit of this with a thirsty brush. for the highlight. Not highlight, pardon me, reflected light, which is light reflecting from the cube back into the sphere. And that's reflected light is part of the shadow family, highlight's part of the light family. So we need this to have, you know, that it looks like there's some reflected light up in there. And we're going to have that this has some cast shadow will wrap up the lower portion of this. This only happens on round objects, so it has to be very round in order for this to do this, but it's a sphere, so this is as round as you can get. And then we're going to try to get just a little bit more dark in this core shadow. Now look at that, it's holding its place, which means that's drying out. So that means I've got to get a little bit wetter, a little bit more water on my brush so I can get this to move. So again, it's really, and it's the hardest thing to get used to is just trying to control this stuff, you know, control water, but it's all about how wet is the paper and how wet is my brush. And, you know, the more I get used to controlling that, the better off my watercolors will be. Now this is getting to the point where, again, it's starting to sink into the paper, and I really need to not play with it. I've got maybe half a minute, if that long. So again, I can just tell by the way it's working. Some of this is you just get used to. But as you're working, just ask yourself, hey, is it moving really nice, or does it seem like it's, like if I start to make a dot and it makes the dot and it leaves there, it doesn't flow, that means the paper is no longer wet. It's now semi-wet, so it'll hold more of a mark. And if it's dry, well, then it'll just make a little dot and make it look like a freckle. And there's no getting that out. It's all about, you know, you got to have enough water. And so that's what we have to get used to when we first start watercoloring in the very beginning, is this idea of how much is it going to take to make it do what I want, for this stuff to have some sort of control. Again, I'm doing what looks like this little stippling. Well, it is stippling, really. It's dropping in. But it's just little dots of pigment. I'm just trying to get just a little bit more in there. And then I'm hoping that it's not too, you know, I'm using this in dry paint, so it's really kind of less water in there. So this is really sort of a semi-wet brush. Now, if it's too wet, it'll push the paint aside. It'll start to do like a little bloom. Like that's what just happened right there, is that the paint was just not, there was too much water in it. So, oops, took that out. Okay, need to leave it alone. Can't play with that anymore. But I can, it's got enough where I can go, okay, there's light values, there's middle values, there's this soft highlight, and I can come back over here and do another wash or a glaze and really, you know, restate that look. So what I'm going to do now is I need to, again, this is going to be drawing, so I need to go to a different place. So I'm going to go ahead and work on this side. Now this is made out of wood, and it's just slightly lighter than this. And we have of our values. This is the light side, this is the middle value, and this is the dark side. So I'm going to start off with the this is the middle value, this is the light side. So I'm going to start off with the middle value. And so again, this is going to be darker than the wall, so I have to remember that. Because this is not white, this is actually sort of like a dusty yellow, orangey brown. And in value, that's darker than this wall by about 2 steps of value. So I need to make sure, as I'm doing this, that it is indeed darker than that wall, but it can't be too dark. It's not like super dark, but it's got to be a darker gray than the wall. Okay, so I had to cut that in. Now I got to hurry because this is starting to make a water line. So again, it's still, whoops, water line's already there. Let's see if we can soften it. Let's see if we can save this. Come across here, come down. All right, whoops. Okay. Okay, see that where it's going over that? And it's making it darker? That's because the paper had dried out and it was starting to set a little bit. So now I'm actually trying to get in there with a little bit with my brush and move the water over it to lift it up a little bit while trying to coax it back out of the fibers of the paper while I can. I'm still going to make a little bit of this darker in a couple places, but again, I was trying to pick it up so I could get it to flow. I really need this thing to flow for me, otherwise it's just not going to have, again, the look that I want. It's not going to have all these wonderful gradations that you can get with watercolor. Okay, so we're starting to get a little bit of a gradation. It's a little darker here, gets a little bit lighter as it moves over. That's what I'm looking for right now, just a little bit of that. Okay. I think I need something smaller because I'm going to drop a little bit dark in that corner. Whoops, too dry. That was almost a dry brush. It was too dry. We don't want it super wet. We want a semi-wet brush. And again, that's where I dunk it and then I tap it on this cloth, or in my case, a paper towel. And you tap it 3 to 4 times, and that will make it a semi-wet brush. And if you have a semi-wet brush on semi-wet paper, that's when you have the absolute most control. But again, a lot of this is just getting used to dealing with the paper, so we're not going to get that fine-tuned with it just yet. So we have a gradation getting darker, getting a little lighter, which is what I was looking for. Just a scotch. Okay. Whoops. In fact, I think that actually got darker because it's actually, yeah, it's just water. So it's already sinking in down here. So this is a good example. There'll be times where you put, like, you think you're putting paint down, and you're really not putting much pigment, but it looks darker because it's wet. And then it dries out, and you're like, hey, what happened? I just put paint there, and it's because it was wet. It wasn't darker at all. So that's what was happening. I was like, wait a minute. And I was like, oh yeah, hold on. Had to remind myself that happens. Now we've got this irregular line here. Now sometimes we can trim that up later. This is so, we're at this point where it's really sort of, it's dangerous, if you will. With watercolor, it's better to leave it alone and then come back. Sometimes. This is probably going to be one of those times. Okay. Alright, so we're going to call that good. We're not going to mess with that anymore. We wouldn't want to. So now we've got this wet area and this wet area. And we really need to, again, leave this alone for a bit. So we're going to come back after this dries and we're going to get this finished up. Alright, back in a bit. Alright, we are back. So let's go ahead, and this is dried out over here. We're really going to work on the cast shadow for this guy, and that this side is in shadow. And so we're going to start by taking the cast shadow and this side and filling it in one shot. So I'm going to mix up a little bit more of this paint. And I need quite a bit of it to, to fill that area. All right, and now we're going to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe I'll come over here first. And the biggest reason you want to use as big a brush as you can is that a smaller brush will start to get waterlined and you get irregular brush strokes, and you're just going to have much more texture with a larger brush. Pardon me, I got that wrong. You're going to have more texture when you use a smaller brush rather than a larger brush. So that's why we try to use the largest brush we can on something like this, if we're, where we're doing it flat. Now if I was doing a something like a fur coat or something, well then I might actually grab a smaller brush because I want more texture. But if you want smooth textures, you want smooth gradations, you use the biggest brush you can possibly find. Well, that you can work with. I mean, it doesn't help if you got a 6-inch brush, but you know you can't get it to do what you want. Well, then that's not going to help anybody. So again, I'm constantly trying to expand this because again, I'm putting this on dry paper, and so this is what I'm using to wet the paper with, this actual pigment. But if I'm not careful, it'll sink in and look terrible. All right, so I'm going to go ahead come on over here. Now we've got all this area again that's drying out, so we got to make sure that all the way along here, okay, we're re-wetting that. I think I'm going to come over here and get a bigger brush. I think I need more paint. Alright, so again we're going to go ahead and grab this brush. We're going to start to put in a little bit more paint here. This is starting to dry out, so we need to come on over here and get this. It was just taking too long. I think I'm going to grab this now and I'm going to trim this in, because it seemed like this was just a little heavy for this corner, a little too big for this corner. So I'm going to go ahead and okay, and then I'm going to try to clean this corner up. Okay, let's go ahead and try to put a little more paint here. Okay, whoops. There we go. All right. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and just keep putting in some paint here. Get this finished out. Or not finished out, but to get started. I mean, because we're really... Yeah, there we go. We need enough paint so we can actually... enough moisture so we can get this started. So I need it to be darker through here for the dark values. Okay, because this is, again, this is flat. And we need to go ahead and just get this laid in here as best we can. Alright, so we're just going to continue to lay this in. Alright. Then we're going to go ahead and grab, now I'm going to grab my, because this needs to be darker up here too, so we're going to darken up here as well. Because this is the cast shadow, and again, cast shadows are usually darker than form shadows. So cast shadow is just where an object blocks the light, but if it's shining on this, you know, on this object, which is all the same value, all the same color, then the cast shadow is actually going to be the one that'll be darker than anything up here and anything on the cube. So now there's going to be gradations, meaning the value will change, and so that doesn't mean that it's always going to be that way everywhere. There's going to be some variations. Like this gets really dark right down here with the cast shadow. It gets a little lighter over here. So this is a little darker along here. Now again, because this is not as it's a little wet, so I'm using drier paint. So I've got almost, again, I'm using sort of like a paste is how dry that paint is. Just wet enough to still make it into paint. Because that's a little drier, it's not going to move as much on this wetter area. I have a little more control. So again, it's all about how wet the paper is, you know, how much moisture's in your brush. All these things make a difference when we're doing this. Okay. So then we got a little bit of maybe a little lighter right along here, along this edge. Made that a thirsty brush. We're going to come back in here with a little bit, not a ton of water, but we're going to come back in here with a little bit so we can soften that out a bit. Okay. And we're just going to go ahead and put a little bit more paint right here in this corner. It gets a little bit darker in the corner, and then it gets a little bit lighter as it moves away from the corner. Alright, so we got, this is getting darker, and there's a gradation getting darker, getting lighter as it comes across here. So, a little dropping in there. So we do that. Alright. Okay, so we've got here again, now we've got light side, dark side on the sphere, light side, dark side on the sphere, light side, dark side on the cube. And we're starting to get something that feels like it's got some depth. Now, this is a little lighter here than it is there. You'd let it dry completely, then I'd re-wet this whole area and I'd do a light gradation here to bring that up. And then I'd let that dry out again, and then I'd actually come here with a little eraser because I can lighten this area, the highlight, by rubbing it with an eraser, but it's the last thing you want to do. But you can lighten this by about a step of value is all. But that's all it takes sometimes to just have that nice pop, right? So again, now we've got this where we've got something that's starting to feel like it has some depth to it. Now there's a couple little razor sharp light lines where I was leaving it to make sure it didn't, you know, melt into other areas. You're going to get that on some of your paintings, and so what you'll do is you'll let it dry. And then you come in with a little brush with a little bit of water to soften that, and you can come up with just a semi-wet brush on dry paper and just tint that in and make it disappear. So again, we want you to go ahead and give it a shot where you're going to try to go ahead and get your paints, get your 140-pound paper that's the cold pressed, and you're going to go ahead and get your paints out, get your 1-inch brush and your 10-inch round, and try to create a gradation or gradations and control your values. And I'm going to be sending you guys a reference that are taking the class. And yeah, you try to do a little bit of watercolor. I want you guys to have fun with it, alright? You guys take care and be more creative. Bye-bye.